Hi, it's Bill Koenig for Straight Circle Martial Arts, and this is the difference between using your hips and using acceleration. So it's funny, I get this question in class a lot, because what happens is you understand there's levels of understanding. There's levels of understanding. So when I teach people in class a lot of times, what happens is I'll take them slow and we'll use hips because they're easier to learn. So what I take is my legs and my hips, and when I do a technique, I will use a hip. See how much I load on that? Because when you're in a standstill, the only way to get power is to load up on those ligaments and tendons. So if I come down and I load the hip, it allows me to pop back. If I load the hip, it allows me to pop. That's that nice earth energy coming from the ground. It's like a baseball swing, where you got to load those hips and everything snaps out through. So when you're learning with new people, a lot of times what happens is you do those bigger hip motions like this, and then you'll accelerate with the hip motion, then you'll load the hips, and then you'll accelerate. And it's good, it works, it's not wrong, it's very powerful. But the problem is when I start doing it in class, because I have different mechanics and more mechanics, when I'm at speed, I start blurring things and people look at me funny and they're going, well, you're not doing that. Well, I would explain why. So there's two things. There's hips and there's acceleration. I need hips at a standstill to actually generate force. If I don't use these hips and this, I can't generate it because I'm just using my arms. And there's no power there. But then there's acceleration that comes from the feet. So you can generate force sometimes not by using big hips, but popping through with your feet. So the faster you are off your feet and the more acceleration you can get, the less hips you're going to use. Because number one, when you're accelerating, you can't make big motions because it throws you off. Like you'll be all over the place. Number two, you don't need it. So if I was doing this with hip, watch, I'm going to come in and drive with the hip, and I'm going to drive back. But if I was doing this with my feet, I would just come in and use that. So what you're going to find with acceleration is that the hip motions are there, they're just much smaller. When I hit, there's still that little tiny hip motion, and then there's a pop. So for me personally, over the years, what I find I like to do better is I like to accelerate. I like to take my feet and I like to come into them like this. I don't like to sit there and plant and try and wrestle with them if I don't have to. But again, you have to learn big to small. So what I would recommend highly is when you're a beginner, you spend a lot of time using your hips and your legs to understand. It's the same with hitting, it's the same with joint locking, right? I want to get my hips involved. I want to load and come down and use that mass and twist with the ligaments and tendons to create that kind of power. And you should do that for a long time. As you get better, what you're going to find is if you can add acceleration, I might do it slow, I don't want to hurt him, come in quick with my feet. I don't use quite as much as the hips to actually generate this. So when you get the idea, and I would hope you do, anyone who's taking traditional martial arts, I would think by now you understand how to go hip to hip to hip to hip. And you should be able to drive those hips. I would hope you have that. If you don't, you need to go back and do that. But if you have that, this is what I'm suggesting you add. What you gotta learn to do is come to that sprinter stance. You get on the balls of your feet a little bit, and what you want to do is you want to learn to propel yourself quick. You have to learn how to pop. You get that foot up off the ground and you pop through them. Don't put the foot down, pick it up and accelerate through them. Before you do any techniques, that's the first thing you got to do. You have to learn how to actually just accelerate and take space. And if you notice, it's 1-2. It's not accelerate and lean like this. It should be banging in like this with both feet. When you learn how to do that mass, now you can start doing with other things. So try it two ways. So I got my hips, right? I'm going to drive this into him using my hip. That's great. Now once in a while, get loose on your feet, get them ready, pop in like this and see if you can kind of explode into the technique. Acceleration's faster, it's shorter, it takes less effort, but it's much harder to learn because the coordination level you have to have with your feet and hands is really high. The problem with accelerating is people don't know where to keep their hands, and often they accelerate and their hands get behind them and they're late. Those hands almost have to jump out a little before your feet to get them into a position to where I can come in and do this properly, even with a punch. You know, I can tell you times I watch people try and accelerate and they go like this, and then their weight on that punch, instead of having that hand where they can accelerate, throw it together like that. Hip, hip, acceleration from the feet. Do the hip first. It's the easiest one to learn. You want to understand, how do I use this body? And then eventually you have to understand, how do I walk through things and use my feet to do them properly. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments and ask questions. Thanks very much for helping grow the channel.